In a showdown with the Maduro government, Venezuela's opposition managed to get a small truckload of supplies in from Brazil, but elsewhere its effort appeared stalled. Cúcuta, Colombia, an ambitious plan by Venezuela's opposition to peacefully import foreign aid in truck convoys degenerated into deadly skirmishes Saturday along the impoverished country's borders, with a smattering of supplies getting through but most of it blocked by armed loyalists of President Nicolas Maduro. The aid deliveries, promised by the opposition leader, Juan Guaidó, have been viewed as a major test of his credibility in the month since he declared himself president and promised to call for new elections and end Venezuela's economic freefall. The humanitarian aid is definitely on its way to Venezuela, in a peaceful manner, to save lives right now, said Mr. Guaidó, standing in front of the warehouse on the Colombian side of the border. As the day progressed, some of the humanitarian aid pierced Mr. Maduro's blockade. One truck got through on a remote section of the border with Brazil, but most of it did not. And although a few members of the security forces defected, Mr. Guaidó's hope that the armed forces would step aside and even join his flag-waving supporters did not come to pass. A day that was billed by the opposition as decisive in the struggle with Mr. Maduro over the country's leadership turned chaotic and inconclusive. Mr. Maduro, furious that Colombia had helped the opposition, broke relations with its government and gave its diplomats 24 hours to get out. There also was no guarantee that the 35-year-old opposition leader, who has emerged as the biggest political threat to Mr. Maduro, would even be allowed back into Venezuela by the authorities, who had barred him from traveling abroad. Mr. Maduro, who has called Mr. Guaidó a Trump administration stooge, said the promises of emergency aid masked an American plot to invade Venezuela, and he vowed to thwart it. As protesters clashed with security forces at various points along the border with Brazil in the south and Colombia in the west, a defiant Mr. Maduro took to a stage in the capital, Caracas, dancing the salsa with his wife and addressing supporters in an event carried on national television. "I am stronger than ever," he said, before asking, "Why am I here? Because you are the ones who decide, not Donald Trump." He also called Mr. Guaidó a puppet of imperialism, and explained the break with Colombia, which effectively sealed Venezuela off, as the borders with Brazil and 3 Caribbean islands were already closed. "We can't keep putting up with the Colombian territory being used for attacks against Venezuela," Mr. Maduro said. "For that reason, I have decided to break all political and diplomatic relations with Colombia's fascist government." The White House condemned the use of force by Mr. Maduro's government, warning that rights violations will not go unpunished, and urging the military to uphold its constitutional duty to protect the citizens of Venezuela and allow aid to enter the country. Mike Pence, the vice president, is scheduled to visit Colombia and meet with Iván Duque, the country's president, on Monday. He is expected to continue urging Mr. Maduro to step down. Earlier on Saturday, on the borders with Colombia and Brazil, opposition protesters waved banners and chanted anti-government slogans as they waited to escort trucks full of humanitarian aid across several bridges into Venezuela. 2 pickup trucks of aid crossed into Venezuela from the Brazilian town of Pacaraima in the country's north, in what opposition figures said was a small but symbolic puncture of Mr. Maduro's pledge to keep unauthorized assistance out. "We did it," said Maria Teresa Balandria, who is the Brazil envoy of Mr. Guaidó. "This is a major victory." But as of Saturday night, the trucks remained stranded on the border, according to Jesus Bobadillo, a Catholic priest in Pacaraima, the Brazilian border town. "This whole thing has failed," Mr. Bobadillo said Saturday night in a phone interview, lamenting that with the borders shut, the crisis could worsen for the neediest people. "The drama of hunger and lack of medicine continues, but now it's even worse because at least before, people had an escape valve." On Friday, Venezuelan forces near the border with Brazil had opened fire on a crowd blocking access to a road, killing 2 people. On Saturday, the National Guard continued to attack, firing tear gas and live ammunition at civilians, according to the opposition lawmaker Américo de Gracia. By the end of the day Saturday, at least 2 more people were dead, according to Alfredo Romero, the head of Foro Penal, an organization that tracks violence in Venezuela. And Colombia's migration authorities said 23 members of the security forces had crossed the border and defected from Mr. Maduro's authoritarian regime.